Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappell. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers.
On this episode, we're discussing the iconic classic and possibly most quotable movie ever, The Princess Bride. Then we'll end with a critique of one lucky author's query.
So, are we ready for the spoilers?
Yes.
This month, we watch The Princess Bride. Here they come. This movie is using a framing device where there's a young boy who's sick and his grandfather visits him to read a story. The story he reads is what makes up the majority of the movie. Two young people, Buttercup and Wesley, fall in love, and Wesley goes off to make something of himself so he can marry her. Wesley is killed by the dread pirate Roberts, and a few years later, Buttercup becomes engaged to the prince. Just before her wedding, she's kidnapped, and the stranger who comes to her rescue is none other than, twist, Wesley, who's not really dead and is now in disguise as the dread pirate Roberts. After the reunion, the couple must deal with the prince who wanted Buttercup killed to start a war that he can profit off of and make their escape. It ends with Buttercup and Wesley kissing, presumably to live happily ever after. Now, Jenny and I have both seen this movie 1,000,000 times and clearly love it. So instead of starting with our overall impressions, I think we should start with our favorite quotes. Jenny, what is your favorite quote?
Okay, so I'm going to take favorite quotes to mean all of my favorite quotes, not like my one single favorite, not just because I'm terrible at picking my one single favorite anything, but also because like there are just so many good quotes in this movie. Well, not all of them. That's too much. Let me sum up. See what I did there?
I did. I get it. I totally get it. All right. So if you're going to cheat, I'm going to cheat too and choose the entire Miracle Max scene.
That's good.
It's so good with Billy Crystal. Oh, it's just the best. So like, I think maybe my favorite from that might be like, true love is the greatest thing in the world except for an MLT, mutton, lettuce, and tomato sandwich where the mutton is nice and lean. I just love that part. Or like, when his wife is like, I'm not a witch, I'm your wife. And just starts
I like when she just
him.
like, I love her, period. Like she just runs out screaming liar.
Yeah. Liar! Yeah, no, it's the best. And then at the end, they make up and they're like, have fun storming the castle.
Yeah.
And they're going to die.
Yeah, that's definitely, I think, one of the biggest quotes. From
It
the movie.
is.
Yeah.
It's a classic, but it's like really good and applicable to basically everything whenever I'm saying goodbye to someone.
True. So what about no more rhymes now? I mean it.
I love that one. Anyone want a peanut?
Exactly.
Okay. All right. We can keep that up all day. Let's talk about what this movie does really well that writers can use in their writing. What do you think?
Okay. So, like, honestly, so much. And I think it speaks to why so many people, including the two of us, love this movie so much, why it's become such a cult classic. Even, 25 years later, people just still really love this movie. And so it was really interesting watching it from like an editor perspective and like analyzing it, because I've never watched it like that before. I had seen this movie so many times, so I'm gonna show my age a little bit here. We had this on VHS when I was a kid, and we watched it. So me and my friends watched it so many times we wore out the VHS copy of it.
Aww.
So this movie and one other one, Spaceballs.
Also a classic.
Right.
We should get to that at some point too.
We had watched it so many times I literally knew all the words to the movie, not just the quotes. So when I watched this again, my whole family ended up wandering in and sitting with me while I was watching it, and they were making fun of me because I'm like saying the lines with the actors as they say it.
How can you not?
Right. It's just it does a lot right in terms of storytelling and being engaging. But so watching it from a more analytical point of view, I think the thing that jumped out to me the most was character agency. I was really impressed with how all of these characters have agency. Sometimes that conflicts, sometimes it helps them work together, but they always have that agency. And I think what's so good about the movie is how different those characters are in terms of personality traits, arcs, characterization, but still they all manage to have agency.
Yes.
So before we dig into how character agency is used in the movie, I think we should talk for a minute about what agency is and what it isn't. Kind of insert the gif here of Inigo saying, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." Agency is one of those concepts that can be really hard for writers to understand. Kind of nebulous, like voice, or like show don't tell. How am I supposed to do that? So I think a lot of us who talk about writing advice and helping writers kind of level up their writing, try to find some more simplistic ways of explaining these kinds of concepts. And so I usually say it means that the characters push the plot forward with their actions and decisions. It means that your main characters have to actively make choices and then act on them and not let other characters make all the decisions or sort of passively stand by as things happen to them. So, Carly, what would you add to that definition of agency?
Exactly. I think agency can also be referred to as like having active characters and not passive characters. I think they're pretty much the same concept. So what I say, and I say this all the time in advice, you want your characters to drive the plot forward, not have the world and the plot solely act upon them and have them just like let it happen. Mm-hmm. Being an active character does not mean that they need to be kick-ass and running around killing everybody. They can choose to still do nothing, and that is having agency. They're still making that choice, but the world then needs to react to that decision. Mm-hmm. So having agency is basically just making a choice that creates the plot that is then reacting to that choice. It's not ignoring your choice. It's constantly evolving and responding. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think like their decisions can always be in response to other characters and what the plot is giving them, because your plot is all about reacting. If they're making random decisions, that's not helpful. Mm-hmm. But they still need to make a decision, and the plot can't just happen to them. They have to have a hand in where their story is going. Otherwise, they'll become weak characters with no agency. So I think probably the most obvious character with the most agency is definitely Wesley / the Man in Black / the Dread Pirate Roberts. Mm-hmm. He's definitely who people most think of when they think of agency. And I mean, he's a pirate. Pirates are all about agency. They do what they want when they want. Like, right? You can't have a pirate who has no agency. I don't think that's possible. So Wesley goes off to make money in order to marry Buttercup, and that kicks off the entire plot. Without him doing that, she wouldn't think he died, quote unquote died. She wouldn't be forced into a marriage with Prince Humperdinck. She wouldn't be miserable. He does everything hinges on this decision that he made. And then later he fights those 3 battles against Anigo, Vizzini, and Fezzik to rescue her. From there, the story seems like it starts to act upon him more. Partially that's because other characters start making a lot stronger of choices, like Buttercup, Prince Humperdinck, things like that. They tend to get a little bit more agency.
That's where that conflict comes in that agency, yeah.
Exactly. But even though they're making the stronger choices, he still is doing a lot. He chooses to go along with Buttercup when she sacrifices herself. He could have fought back in that moment. He chose
run back into the fire swamp.
Right. He chose not to. He chose to just go with it. And that seems like it's not a choice, but really is. He doesn't let the torture break him. That's definitely somewhat of a choice, or at least showing his strength of character.
Right.
But most importantly, when he's still half dead, he comes up with the plan to get inside the castle and rescue her. While he's unable to fight or even walk, he's using fear and words as weapons to defeat Humperdinck. And he's making so many choices throughout those moments. Everyone's making choices around him, but he's still contributing to pushing that plot forward. If he didn't use his words to defeat Humperdinck, they would have all failed. So he's not letting everything just happen to him. He's actively participating.
Right. Yeah, so I think while you were saying this, I was thinking that a lot of times I think what trips authors up in terms of agency is feeling like their characters don't have options. So like if somebody is in a position where they're stuck. So like let's take Wesley when he's in the pit of despair and he's like physically tied down, like he's incapable at that point of physically doing anything other than what he's doing. You know, he still then at that point has the choice of how he reacts to what's being done to him.
Exactly.
And I think so that speaks to what you were saying about that he chooses not to let this break him, you know, and it's an active choice. You know, so I think that that's something really important to take into consideration. And in terms of a tip for authors, sometimes what you can do when you're in that position where as the author you feel stuck, helping your character come up with the options, thinking of what the possibilities are in terms of how they can act, what decisions they can make, looking at how they react to what's being done to them is a really important tool for that author toolkit. And it brings me to the one who really stuck out to me, the one character who really stuck out to me in this was Buttercup. And I think watching it as a kid and not ever really having thought about it in any more detail than that, it's easy to see Buttercup as a weak person.
It really
because
is.
A lot happens to her and she doesn't physically fight back. She is not like you said, like she's not like a kick-ass character, you know? She just kind of like gets flung around and flops down a lot. You know, she's got that big red dress on through most of the movie that's just like, you know, flouncing around as she's getting tossed from one place to another.
I mean, you can't kick somebody when you're wearing that big red dress. It's just
really
not
true.
possible.
It looks like heavy fabric too.
It really does.
You know,
It's quality, high quality.
I mean, you know, she was going to be the princess, so
Yeah.
But so compared to other characters who act on their motivations through fighting or other physical means, she seems pretty passive. And then on top of that, she is one of those characters who's kind of stuck. And so I hear this from authors all the time about how either their characters don't have agency in the beginning of the story because that's their arc, is to learn to like take more active control over their lives, or because they're in these situations where they don't really have many choices or any control over their own lives. So Buttercup's a great example of that kind of character. She doesn't have a lot of options in terms of fighting back. Really almost from the beginning of the story. It's not shown in the movie, but it's implied that she doesn't really have any choice in whether or not she marries the prince. So, you know, at one point she says, like, she never said she loved him. You know, once she realizes that the man in black is really Wesley, you know, it's obvious that she definitely wants to be with Wesley, all the way up to the point where at the end, toward the end of the movie, she has decided that she would rather die, literally die, than to marry the prince. So, you know, she's just really stuck in this situation with being engaged to the prince. And what I was just going to say is I think that that is a very different kind of princess than what we're used to seeing, who like dreams of being married to the prince. So then she's engaged to the prince without really any concern over whether or not she really wants to marry him. Then she's kidnapped, and she's held with her hands bound, so she can't really do anything physically there. Then she's back to marrying the prince, who we now know she doesn't want to marry. But despite all of that, she shows agency in what she can control. So as the author, it would be easy to think, well, she's just sitting there with her hands bound. Like, what is she supposed to do? Well, she throws herself overboard when they're on the ship to try to swim away. Fails miserably, but she tries.
Yeah, it's worth a shot.
Right, exactly. She, like you said, later she bargains to try to save Wesley's life when the prince catches them outside of the fire swamp. And even to see Wesley kind of trying to talk her out of it, she's like, no, knowing you're alive is what matters the most to me,
Right.
And so then through the whole movie, even when she is, physically held from being able to do anything, she also uses her words as weapons. She is not afraid to insult people, to let them know that, trouble is coming to them because of how they're acting, any of those things. And so even though she can't physically really do much, she makes choices to take what actions she can. And what's more, those actions are what pushes the plot forward. So, for example, her bargaining for Wesley's life is what makes Wesley end up in the pit of despair. She ends up back in the castle. Like, she also could have turned to Wesley and said, come on, let's go back and live in the fire swamp, But she didn't. She was like, I don't want this to be hanging over us. I'm going to make this choice independent of what anyone else kind of thinks I should do.
And I might disagree with her choice, but she's making a choice.
Exactly. And so all those are attempts to control her own fate. And so this is such an important point, what you were just saying about, you disagree with her choices. As the author, don't be afraid to let your characters fail. Sometimes their attempts are going to succeed, and sometimes they won't. But it's how they deal with the consequences either way. That's how they continue to show agency and move the story forward. And a lot of times when they fail, it can make the story more interesting because it creates more conflict.
Yeah, I fail all the time. I prefer characters that fail.
Relatable.
Right? I think also to what you were saying, like, she made the choices that she could. And a lot of times authors feel like they want to show that character growth of making or learning to have agency when they think they are passive in the beginning. And I think the key to that is making sure that while the character believes they have no other choice to make, that readers can see that they are still making a choice based on those circumstances. Right. So Buttercup probably thought there was nothing else she could do in that moment but to promise to marry Humperdinck so that Wesley could get away. We as viewers feel like, oh, maybe you could have gone back in the fire swamp or let Wesley try to fight.
Well, and even Wesley and the prince at that point turn to her and both go, what?
Right. Like, what is this
even
choice
they
you're
never
making?
expected her to say that.
And, like, it's important to let the character grow and make more choices, but the reader should always realize that they are making choices from the beginning, whether or not the characters believe that they are. They can... Right. It's still a choice to let the plot beat you down. It's still a choice, even though the character feels like there's nothing else that they can do.
Right, and the way we see that is through your main character's interiority.
Exactly.
We need to see the character thinking through and weighing their options and making a conscious decision one way or the other. And so often, and I think this is the case with real life too, we feel like we don't have any options because we don't like any of the options we have, you know, or because we don't have the resources we need to be able to do the thing we really want to do. Right. So when you have a character who has a more passive kind of personality, or they're in a position where they can't make a lot of big changes in their life, you're absolutely right. It's just about, showing how maybe they don't like any of the options they do have, but we need to see through their point of view, how they are choosing something.
Exactly. So I think the next big three characters are Anigo, Fezzik, and Vizzini. Our little band of misfit criminals.
Definitely misfits.
Oh, yes. I'm going to kind of list some of their choices because I like all of their choices. They're so much fun. So let's start with Anigo. He's doing a job, but he is constantly choosing to use those jobs to his advantage. So he's on the lookout for his father's murderer, the six-fingered man. And even though Vizzini hired him to help kidnap this princess, he's just always looking around trying to find the man to avenge his father's death. And he sticks to his code throughout the entire movie. He never wavers from wanting to do this. He chooses to ignore advantages that the plot gives him, and he fights the man in black on his own terms. He chooses to stand up and fight against the six-fingered man by getting the man in black to help him break into the castle. So his motivations and his goals and his choices are driving the plot a ton for these other characters. He is affecting the rest of these characters with his agency.
Even though he's not a main character.
Even though
he's not really. He's more of a secondary character.
Right. And for secondary characters to have this agency and choose and drive the plot is really great and important. If he didn't want to go after the six-fingered man, if he didn't make those choices, Wesley never would have been freed from the pit of despair. They never would have broken into the castle. They never would have saved Buttercup.
Right.
So he's making all these decisions that's driving the plot. There's Fezzik too. Fezzik also makes choices, although they're maybe not as apparent. He also won't do what Vizzini said, because who wants to listen to Vizzini? So he doesn't sneak attack the man in black. And despite being part of the brute squad that's sent to clear out all the criminals in the forest, he doesn't blindly follow. He instead finds Fezzik and sobers him up.
Inigo,
sorry.
Yes.
Yes, he is Fezzik. Thank you.
Are they not just friend goals or what?
I mean,
so fantastic.
They're more than friend goals. I feel like they're romantic goals. No?
Can't they just be friends?
I mean, they can be, but I
feel
like
Inigo doesn't really have any mental space in his head to be in love with anybody.
And now he does.
Now he does after the end of the movie.
Yeah, after the end of the movie, he is prepared to finally confess his love to Fezzik. This is where I'm at in this story, but
this should definitely be and that could definitely be part of, there's been talk of doing a sequel to it, which would be,
they should not do that.
But anyway, yeah, a sequel about Inigo and Fezzik have gone off and they became they were pirates and had a long happy life together. Andre the Giant has passed away, so he obviously couldn't be in the movie.
Right.
So this could be just Inigo after Fezzik has died and he doesn't know what to do with himself now.
Well, that's heartbreaking. I don't want to watch that. I want to see them having pirate adventures with Fezzik being his first mate and they fall in love and it's so great. I'm happy. Who wants conflict and sad conflict? No. Anyway, I feel like Fezzik throughout the story makes a lot of small empathetic choices.
Yes.
He is actually, to me, kind of the moral and the heart and the love center of the story. He is always putting his friends before himself. He is choosing to support these characters out of love and loyalty. And his choices, I mean, if he didn't help Anigo, then they wouldn't have saved the six-fingered man, and everyone's choices are furthering the plot along.
Right.
And then finally we have Vizzini. Everybody kind of loves him, despite the fact that he's kind of a villain. I don't know that I really see him as a villain personally, but
I think he is a villain. He's just kind of an incompetent villain.
He's incompetent, but he's also kind of just doing a job. Like,
but his
I don't.
job is kidnapping and murdering someone.
I
I think
mean,
that
money
makes him a
is
villain.
money. No,
Okay. All right.
okay. No, yeah, it's his job. You know,
Okay.
it's fine. It's fine.
He's just a
not-
freelancer. He's just
yeah,
a freelancer.
He's a freelancer. This is what freelancers do.
Toss a coin to your witcher.
He, yeah, he just wants. I mean, yeah, he just wants to kidnap and kill people, and he has no skin in the game. He just wants money and to be paid and to do a good job and impress the prince and whatever.
He just needs a good reference. He needs
just
that
wants a good
testimonial
reference.
for his website.
We would all do a lot for some testimonials, let me
Sure
tell
we
you.
would. I just want to make it clear, I'm not planning to kidnap or murder anyone. I can't speak for
yeah.
Carly, but I'm not.
I'm not planning on it, no.
But you wouldn't necessarily turn it down for the right amount of money.
I mean, I would, you know.
Asking the tough questions on Story Chat Radio.
No, I would. It's fine. I'll read your book. It's fine. But so his motivations are super simple. Get paid, do the job. But his big motivation is, I think, he just wants to be the smartest person in the room. He's constantly putting down his teammates. He sets up this whole big battle of the wits, and it just really shows like his hubris. Like, all he wants is to be the mastermind and be the clever one. And I think his actual biggest character agency moment is pretty tiny. It's when he distracts Wesley with his "hey, look over there" moment, and then he switches the glasses because he assumes he knows which one is poisoned. But instead of just picking the glass that is not poisoned in his mind, he switches them because he thinks this is really gonna fool Wesley and show how smart I am. And it's just this tiny small moment and this small decision that, while maybe it doesn't affect the plot, because little does he know they're both poisoned, he thinks it will affect the plot. And it shows who he is. It shows his motivations, it shows his arrogance and his utter confidence in himself. He looks down on everyone, and this choice really shows his character. So they need they need agency to not only show how the plot is going to be affected. It's not only going to move the plot forward, but it's really going to show what is important to them in the choices that they make based on the input they have. We learn about their motivations and their goals by the decisions that they make and the inherent meaning in those decisions.
Yes.
So I think it's time for our last big character.
Well, and really, so I see this character in the same way as what you were just saying about Vicini. So our last big character is Humperdinck. He's the main villain, so of course we have to talk about him. And he's such a good villain because he's so arrogant. He's so deceitful. Like, he's just slimy. He's just slimy, and you can't help but hate him. But he also has this real cowardly streak. He's clearly used to getting his own way and having all the power to make all of his choices happen. I mean, he is the prince, after all, you know?
He's the epitome of spoiled brat frat boy.
Right. So I think for him, too, so his most interesting moment to me is also something that's really small. Compared to, we see him through the whole movie where he's tracking them. He can tell that the poison that was used was iocane powder, even though it's, supposed to be undetectable. Somehow he can tell. Some things that he really...
Magic.
Yeah, so we find out that he was behind the plot to kidnap and murder Buttercup. But some of that stuff, there was no way for him to know, except, really having some skills. So, I have a little bit of respect for him for that,
He really does.
He does. But so, despite seeing that he is this very intelligent person, we see how arrogant he is. So I think his most interesting moment, and possibly his funniest as well, is at the end where his arrogance leads him to listen to Wesley's whole, like, to the pain speech.
I love that speech.
I know. And so Humperdinck chooses to give himself up rather than risk being disfigured. And so, like you were just saying about Vicini, like, it's interesting because he could have physically defeated Wesley. But he isn't sure that Wesley couldn't actually defeat him, so he doesn't take that chance. He doesn't know what will happen to him, whether they'll kill him or leave him for the guards to find, but he would rather risk death than disfigurement.
It's quite the choice.
It is. And so again, this choice reveals his character. And again, though, so these are the choices he sees in his mind, right? Like, he could have called the guards in. I'm sure he has, 10 guards not far away from Buttercup's room, although they're running through the castle that whole time. You don't see any freaking guards.
There's no guards.
Right, he could have called some guards in. He could have just walked in and just killed Wesley and not listened to him monologue that whole time. But he didn't see those as options. So really his arrogance is what led him to this point. That choice reveals his character, what's most important to him, and then he acts on that. That's really at the heart of agency. In order for the character's decisions and actions to make sense to your readers, they have to come directly from what's most important to the character. It ties into their goals, their emotional wounds, kind of a lot of stuff we don't really have time to get into today with characters. But it's a really important way to show who your character is, how they use their agency, which choices they make. And in the case of your point of view characters, as I mentioned earlier, making sure you're showing how they deliberate those options, how they come to their decision, and how their emotions play into that choice as well.
Exactly. He didn't think he had any choices. He thought he had to do it, even though we as viewers or readers could see he had a million choices he could have made in that moment.
Right.
So it's a classic example of, well, my character doesn't have any choice, but they don't have any choice based on their history and the input they have and their emotions and their motivations. All of those things factor into every decision that they're making. So while it might seem like they don't have a choice, they really do, but it's the outside factors that make them feel limited.
Right.
I love it.
Yep.
All right. So this month, we have a query from a YA fantasy that touches on fairy tales and books. So I can definitely see how it relates to this movie. Jenny, what did you think of our query?
I think the premise was really interesting. I really enjoyed that a lot. It sounds like a book I would like to read.
Oh, me too.
So the query, though, did touch on a problem. It has a problem that I see in a lot of queries. And that is that it doesn't really say anything about the main character's arc. And so, like, I can imagine a lot of authors thinking, like, what do you mean I have to touch on the character arc too? I only have a couple of hundred words as it is to explain my plot. But it isn't as hard as it sounds. In the first paragraph of the story summary, we need to see what the protagonist's emotional wound is. This is the internal problem they have to overcome to get through they have to overcome through the involvement in the events of the plot. So that might be that they feel lonely, or that they don't belong, or that they have no belief in themselves. So that's something that's with them before the story actually even starts. The good news is you don't need a whole paragraph for this. Just a few words or a short sentence is all you really need, and you can definitely work that into the rest of the explanation of their normal world that goes into that first paragraph. We just need to see, what does the main character want more than anything else, and why? And then in that full paragraph of the summary, where you're going to kind of leave your hook, we need to see how the main character is going to have to face that emotional wound to resolve the plot. Again, you don't need a lot of words for this. The best place for this is usually in that final dilemma that's often set up as like The main character must choose option 1, that includes facing down their inner demons, or option 2, which means they'll fail to achieve the goal of the plot.
Exactly. I also really, really wanted to read this book, but I think what we often refer to as internal stakes is what was kind of missing. There was emotional impact, and I saw hints of it, but it wasn't the why of the character, and that's what we're missing here. The big problem I was also seeing was that they were trying to explain the world too much. Like, we were getting a little bogged down in setting the scene, which is an easy trap to fall into with fantasy, because you feel like you need to explain the world for the reader to understand what kind of story you have, because a lot of that window dressing is very important. But you really need to be very concise with any kind of world building, scene setting you put into here. It's nearly impossible to set up a world in a query. You just don't have the space, you don't have the word count to do it. So instead, only show us what is important to the character wound, as Jenny said, and the main plot. In this one, we're trying to understand a magical system that does have implications on the plot. It seems to drive a lot of the plot, but we're getting bogged down with all the details and various extra stuff that seems like you think it's needed, but it's really not. We only need to know the stuff that affects the plot, so keep it as simple and basic as possible especially when it comes to magic. We need like one line to explain the main character's powers and what that means to the world in general. After that, just focus on the plot and the stakes, as we have said in many, many episodes. It's all about the stakes. I do like a little bit of flavor added in to like differentiate your world. It is part of what is going to sell your book. But make sure it's only like a couple of words that are really tied into the plot. Kind of like voicey world building flavorings that you pepper in. But don't feel the need to over explain them or explain them even at all. Just like kind of toss little flavored bits in there that kind of are intriguing. It's going to hook your agent in and kind of pull them. And then toss out all the rest of your magical rules. We'll figure them out later. We'll figure them out when we're reading the book. You don't need that in the query.
Right.
So just really focus on your character and the plot and how the rules in the magical system affects those. Otherwise, we really don't need to know much about it. Just keep it really, really simple. Any other thoughts?
No, I think that's really great advice. It was a lot of the same stuff I saw.
Yeah.
I guess I would like to say, it occurs to me that I think part of the problem with writing a query is you're thinking of, like, I have to condense my whole story down and try to explain the whole plot. And so you're like, you add in all these details because they are important to your story, right? They're important in the book form. If you tried to read the whole book and you didn't have those details in there, it wouldn't make sense. But when you're writing your query, you have to make sure that the details you're putting in are really only relevant to the other details you have within the query. So sometimes you might put something in that's super important in the scheme of the overall plot, but it doesn't connect with anything else in the query, so it doesn't make sense to have it there.
Right.
So at that point, you have to question, do you need to rework the query to make sure this super important plot point is mentioned, or whatever the detail is? Or is it okay to remove that one particular detail? So just make sure, when you're thinking about which details to include, you want plot, you want stakes, you want the main character, their motivation, their emotional wound, kind of who they are. But all of the details need to be related to those elements. So just try to keep that in mind when you're trying to decide what details to put in and what details not to put in.
Agreed. All right. So this comes to the end of our podcast on The Princess Bride, and I'm already sad because it's the best movie, and I could talk about it for another 2-3 hours if you would like. But
At least. We could just spend that long just quoting each other.
we could just reenact
quoting the
the
movie to
whole
each other.
movie. Yeah,
That's
let's
it.
just reenact it.
Okay, let's do that now.
Okay, let's throw out the rest of this. We'll do that now. Everyone, buckle up. Here we
I
go.
want to be the grandpa.
Oh, no, I want to be the grandpa. I related to him so much this time that I did not as a kid. But this time I'm like, yeah, that would be me.
I think
Sit down and listen to
I
my
think that
story.
means you're getting old.
Yeah,
I
I
think
know.
that's what it means.
It does. It definitely does. All right. Anyway, so just letting everyone know that we are taking a break from the podcast for the month of April because we are both involved in this annual contest called Revise and Resub, #RevPit. It starts on April 18th. And if you don't know what that is, it's a contest where authors with completed manuscripts can win a full developmental edit by a professional editor like Jenny and I. It's always fun, but it's also super time consuming. So we will be back in May with our next movie, Knives Out.
I can't wait. I'm very excited for this movie.
I'm so excited.
I'm already thinking about what I want to talk about with it.
Classic.
Yes.
Oh no, it's so good. So we'll be talking about that mystery movie. It's already a classic and it's been out for like months. So watch our Twitter page for updates, and you can get more information about RevPit at www.reviseresub.com. And we will have another query or blurb critique in May. So if you want your query featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that on our Twitter page.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com, or you can follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at StoryChatRadio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.